Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is, so I'm Dr. Louise Hewitt. I'm Director of the Innocence Project London. And our presentation today, I'm presenting today with my colleague, Steve.
Hi, I'm Stephen Cole. I'm a Technical Director at Acumen Forensics.
And
I've been involved in...
So go on, sorry, Steve, go on.
I just wanted to cover my background. Obviously, I've been involved in CCTV for over 30 years. And daily involved in its collection and its presentation to court.
So Steve and I'm Director of the Innocence Project London, and Stephen and I have actually became known to each other because we started working on a case, and it was as a result of the work on that case that this presentation and this segment of the live stream is coming to you today, on the impact of CCTV evidence in England. So CCTV images and footage as well is now pretty much almost commonplace in some police investigations. And I think it's probably fair to say, Steve, I'm fairly sure you'll probably agree with this, that it's become an integral part almost into many police investigations, and it's an important source of evidence. And whilst it can be a valuable asset to the police, and I think it's probably important to point that out. Back in London, England, in 1999, we had some nail bomb attacks on the 17th, the 24th, and the 30th of April. They were quite globally publicised. And the perpetrator of those attacks was actually arrested after the result of a CCTV image was circulated. The image was taken from the first attack on the 17th of April. And shortly after the last attack on the 30th of April, the perpetrator was arrested by police as a result of the circulation of that CCTV image. Now, what that image did was not only allow the police to identify the suspect and then go on and arrest that person, but it also enabled them to eliminate other claims from other organisations that were claiming responsibility, which was a number of right-wing groups. So it helped the police focus and narrow their investigation. So whilst there's benefits, and in order to provide balance, we do want to acknowledge that, CCTV is only effective in terms of the prevention and the detection of crime where it is of sufficient quality to be useful. And where CCTV isn't of a sufficient quality, it can not only be detrimental in terms of a defendant's case and the balance of that case, but it can still have significant influence on the jury. And when this happens, when poor quality CCTV is put into court, then there is a very real risk of wrongful convictions and miscarriages of justice. So over the next hour, both Steve and I are going to examine just how important it is to use good quality CCTV footage and images as evidence in court. We're going to identify to you what poor quality CCTV looks like, show how influential CCTV can be on a jury. Oh God, let me click back. Look at poor quality CCTV footage and how that quality can contribute, or poor quality can contribute to miscarriages of justice and wrongful convictions, but also to wrap up, set out what needs to be done in terms of the use of CCTV as evidence in criminal investigations. So this is the law bit, okay? This is the legal responsibility bit before we get to Stephen's very interesting demonstration aspect of it. But it's nonetheless important. And I think, I can see Steve laughing, I think it also gives a context in terms of the backdrop that Steve and I are having our conversations in, but also kind of the uphill struggle that law enforcement and indeed the criminal justice system faces in terms of the use of CCTV as evidence in court. So in England and Wales, there is no primary legislation controlling the use and publication of CCTV images. Now, what do I mean by that? There is no single piece of law that acts as a reference point for law enforcement in their investigation. And what I will go on and show you in the next few slides is the sheer volume and body of legislation that law enforcement has to follow and adhere to in the management of evidence. And that's all evidential material, not only CCTV images. And they also have to consider, in terms of CCTV being evidence, that's images as well as moving footage, the general rules of admissibility for all evidence. So there's lots here. There's policy, there's legislation, there's general rules going on, and there's nothing that acts as a single guidance point. Just very briefly touching on the general rules of admissibility for evidence. As with most aspects of evidence or most forms of evidence going into court, the CCTV image or footage must be relevant. It must be relevant to a fact that is in issue in the case. And it can be relevant also to the credibility of a witness or to the reliability of any other aspect of evidence. But also any CCTV image or footage, as with any other aspect of evidence, regard has to be had for whether introducing that evidence in court would be prejudicial in any way to the defendant's case. So as you will see as we go through, there's lots of things at play here that have to be considered in terms of bringing CCTV into court. So it's not a simple process. Now, in terms of the legislation, on the screen in front of you now, you will see that this is pretty much all, I think, of the key legislation that the police have to consider during their investigation and beyond into that court process in terms of the management of evidence. You've got the Criminal Justice and Police Act 2001, the Criminal Procedures and Investigations Act 1996, PACE, which is the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984, the Police Reform Act, not 200, I've just noticed my own typo in my slide, and then Data Protection Act 2018 and the General Data Protection Regulation and the Law Enforcement Directives. All of these things govern the management of evidence, not just CCTV evidence, but evidence more broadly. And there are many aspects of this legislation, as I will show you, that are relevant to law enforcement in terms of how they process the information and how they process the evidence. Very quickly, dealing with data protection. Data protection and the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, becomes relevant because CCTV images and footage contain data. They contain, more often than not, people's images and people's information. And so again, when using or processing that information, it has to be relevant to the case that's being presented in court. And the Law Enforcement Directive, the LED, runs parallel in terms of the GDPR, and that covers the processing of data for the purpose of law enforcement. So any police investigations, any use of evidence, relating it back to CCTV has to be compliant in all of those ways in terms of the what the General Data Protection Act and the GDPR and the Law Enforcement Directive will require of police forces. Now, turning to the Criminal Justice and Police Act 2001, this gives the power for the police to seize and sift. Now, what that means is that investigators can remove material from premises and take it to be examined elsewhere. Now, this is particularly important if they are removing CCTV equipment or anything related to maybe digital forensics. And what they need to maybe view that digital forensics or view the CCTV is not available on site. So they have the power to remove that, take it off site and use equipment to consider and obviously view that information. But in terms of how they do that, they have to operate and remove that CCTV in such a way that it preserves the evidence. Now, the Criminal Procedure and Investigations Act 1996 is slightly more intricate in terms of the requirements that it places on the police and the duty it places on the police. Now, the CPIA actually places a duty on police in England and Wales to pursue all reasonable lines of inquiry to obtain evidence. So even where CCTV footage may be difficult to extract from whatever CCTV system is available, all reasonable attempts should be made to achieve this. Now, I'm fairly sure between Steve and I, we've got some stories where we've seen that maybe that hasn't actually been done. And what's really interesting, I think, is, and this is probably for another live stream event, but what is really interesting is that requirement in terms of, even when it's difficult to extract CCTV, all reasonable attempts should be made. But that is what the CPIA mandates law enforcement in England and Wales to do. Now, continuing with the Criminal Procedure Investigations Act, the CPIA, in England, we have a national policing body. It's currently called the National Police Chiefs Council, and that's a national coordination body for law enforcement in the UK. So it represents all of our 43 odd, I've probably missed a police force, number of police forces throughout England and Wales, and also Scotland, but it also represents British police chief officers. Now, the National Police Chiefs Council produces guidance for police officers on a range of things. And one aspect of its guidance actually places emphasis on the Criminal Procedure and Investigations Act Code of Practice and how it should be followed by all investigators. So that's all police and that's all civilian investigators as well. Sorry, Stephen, you said, can I come in? Just come in. I can talk.
I just want to touch on the point you made about the CPIA, and one of the problems that the police do have, just to put the boot on the other foot, as it were. One of the problems we have in the UK now is just the prevalence of CCTV. So I know this is not internationally the same, but on the average English street, almost every property will have CCTV, and it's recording 24/7. And that's one of the bigger problems we face now, certainly as investigators. The word of the CPIA Act was written in 1996, when most CCTV wasn't domestic. It was controlled by government bodies, so councils, etc., and it would be managed in such a way that the public would be almost unaware of it was there. But the problem for the police now and right now is just the sheer number of cameras, and being able to demonstrate that they've captured everything is almost an impossible task. So just to put their side of things on there, it's fair to mention that there's so many cameras that actually applying the act now is almost untenable. But they've got to demonstrate that they've at least tried, and that's key for me, is that they've at least tried to do that and can demonstrate that. And that's one of the key riding factors now, is about showing a willingness to not be diverted from a predetermined set of events and to leave it open so that they can go back. And to be fair, that's what they're doing now. They're capturing more footage than they actually need. And that in itself has its other problems.
Yeah, but it's not just footage, is it? It's doorbells. You've got the Ring doorbells as well. And over here in England and Wales, if your CCTV camera is facing the street over a certain distance, you actually should have a warning label saying CCTV in operation. Should, inverted commas.
Should, very do. Should, and should be blanked out, and they shouldn't actually show anything that's not on your property. However, back in the real world, all this footage is, I mean,
doesn't always work that way.
I think we're known in the UK for having more CCTV cameras than anywhere else in the world. But just for the viewers today, you cannot walk down an English street and not be recorded by a camera. It's highly unlikely any street in the UK, you cannot walk down and not be recorded, and that sort of needs to be thought about in the background when we're talking about what we're talking about today. Sorry, Louise, I didn't want to spot your flow.
No. Next time, just plow right in there.
I will do.
The way the screen's set up with the little chat over there and the slides over here, I've got a one-track mind, so just jump in.
Cool.
But in terms of, and that, I think that adds context to this in terms of the volume of material sometimes, I think that police face in investigations, what could be useful, what might not be useful. But what the Code of Practice does under the CPIA is provides the way in which police officers have to record and retain as well as reveal material that they're using in terms of the disclosure process as well. And all of it has to be relevant. It's underpinned by the test of relevance. And that relevance test is actually set out in the Criminal Procedure Investigations Act under Section 5. And that also relates to how long any CCTV should be retained in terms of before the case goes to court, but also more importantly, and again, for a totally separate live stream event, how long the material should be retained after a defendant is convicted. And we see that in terms of the Innocence Project London's work when trying to make an application to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. If there is CCTV that we're trying to get hold of, it's very difficult to get hold of that sometimes, despite the fact that it should be retained, especially if someone is serving a life sentence for, serious indictable offences. It should be retained, and that individual should be able to have access to it. But there is, again, no legislation governing that. And so, as you can see, and I hope what we're trying to get across here is the many layers, I think, that operate relating to CCTV images and footage as evidence. And it's just not a simple process. And this is what the police kind of have to wade through during their investigations on a regular basis. So moving on, we've got the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984, which is referred to colloquially as PACE. And that governs how CCTV is used as an investigative tool. So, for example, it also relates to how CCTV images are circulated. I mentioned when we opened the circulation of a CCTV images that caught the London nail bomber and how useful that was. But there is a very fine line between circulating those images in the hope that someone will recognise the person that's in that image, so the potential offender. And there's a distinction between circulating them for recognition, but also using them for identification. And actually that process is governed in law. And it's a difficult process that we've seen in our casework that sometimes police don't make the distinction between. And sometimes that's too late then when that gets into court. So recognition, you circulate a CCTV image in the hope that someone will recognise it. The person who recognises the individual on the image isn't necessarily or always someone that's a witness or an eyewitness to the offence that's taken place. They recognise the person, and then their information is able to open up other avenues of investigation to the police. Identification as something distinct is normally made by an eyewitness to an offence. And that ends up more often than not with that individual being used as a witness in court more often than not for the prosecution. But identification has to be carried out formally. There are formal legal procedures taking place, and a witness that is used for identification purposes should not be shown any CCTV or photos of a suspect prior to a formal identification procedure. Now, I'm sure Steve's seen otherwise, and I know I've seen otherwise. So that rule isn't always followed, and CCTV images and footage unwittingly becomes involved in the legal conflation of recognition and identification evidence. And that too can be problematic. I don't know, Steve, if you've got anything you want to add.
One of the things we come across is obviously witness testimony in terms of their recollection of events. And obviously CCTV is a really powerful tool to back up that recollection or equally dismiss that recollection. The problem that Louise has touched upon is the blurred lines between somebody having a recollection and then being seen the CCTV and then remembering an exact sequence of events because they've actually seen it from a different angle. And that happens a lot with CCTV, this predilection to decide to you see what you want to see. And that's one of the problems you get with CCTV. It's one of its biggest powers, and it's one of the best uses of it. However, you deal with this witness problem where you may have a really good eyewitness that's given really good testimony, but the CCTV simply doesn't follow that story. It doesn't mean that witness is not correct in their recollection. It's just the two are never going to be exactly the same unless somebody's been coached.
Absolutely. So moving on forward, Police Reform Act 2002, not 200, as I had in the opening slide there. This provides for the power to seize CCTV. Now, that power is also given by virtue of this act to civilian staff. So it's not only police officers that can collect CCTV evidence, but it can be conferred on civilian police staff as well. Now, the APO Practice Advice on the use of CCTV in criminal investigations, 2011. So earlier on, I mentioned the National Police Chiefs Council. National Police Chiefs Council, before it got changed into that organisation, was ACPO, the Association of Chief Police Officers. And this practice advice was issued in 2011. Now, I couldn't find any newer version of this practice advice. And that's not to say that maybe it does exist and it's buried somewhere on the internet, but this was the most accessible version. Now, this practice guidance on the use of CCTV is obviously dated 2011, but it highlights how the presentation of CCTV in court should enable it to be shown at its best quality. And it should be for the purpose of assisting the jury in understanding the evidence. And it should aim for clarity and simplicity. And I think what Steve, and I'll hand over to him in a minute, but what Steve will show you is, despite this practice advice, that's not always achieved, is it, Steve?
No, I mean, one of the big problems that the police face, and I'm not shouting out for the police. It's just I do understand the issues that they face.
Oh, it's balance, isn't it? For everything you've got to provide.
It is about balance, but what we've got to understand almost as little as a decade, we've gone from the recovery CCTV used to be walking into a premise, a corner shop or something similar, and pressing eject and walking out with a tape. And it used to be that simple. What the police have had to deal with is this explosion of digital media. And initially, you could have 500-600 different devices in a city and nobody actually knowing how any of them worked. So this has been a very long process to get to the point where we are now finally sort of catching up and addressing these issues. They've been long running, and that's obviously my involvement with Louise is generally cases that have already happened. Yeah. We're sort of getting there in the UK with CCTV now, but almost last week we weren't, if that makes sense. It's such a fluid technique that CCTV, how it's recovered, how it's used, that it does change week to week in terms of what can be achieved.
Definitely. And I think it also goes back to the point of what you were saying earlier. And I wish I remembered that figure, as in per number of CCTV cameras versus number of heads of population, because that figure is out there somewhere. I know it is. But I think there's just so much footage nowadays, isn't there, sometimes? And but as we've seen in the case that Stephen and I are working on together, that whilst you've got footage, sometimes that footage doesn't show what you need it to, and it is dating back, years and years. And so the practice advice has sometimes come in post cases that we're now working on, and post the one that we're after the one that we're working on together, or it needs updating, and it's kind of this hybrid situation. Yeah. So there are a lot of benefits. And again, this presentation is very much about balance, and there are benefits of CCTV. As I highlighted, you can help identify a suspect, someone who's involved in a crime. It can help identify a vehicle, establish a version of events, a timeline of events. It can support an eyewitness version of events. You can see when someone went into a building, when they came out of a building, or when they came into the scene, left the scene. You can look at behavior, someone's body language or behavior before or after a situation has taken place. It can even help you identify forensic techniques, so the potential areas to look for fingerprints or look for DNA, DNA to collect. And it can also help the jury understand events that really can't be described sometimes because they're so fast paced or there's so many people. So there are a huge amounts of benefits to CCTV. Now, CCTV is regulated. So despite the fact that, as we've shown, there's no single piece of legislation that would help with police investigations and help finesse, I think, the process of how CCTV is used as evidence, but it is regulated by the forensic regulator. And that's introducing a validated methods for image comparison in line with an accredited standard, which is applied to other forensic disciplines. So the forensic science regulator has the role of setting quality standards for forensic science in the criminal justice system in England and Wales. Now, the aim of this requirement is to embed a systematic approach to quality. So that means understanding methods, validating software and systems, but above all, ensuring that everyone involved, from crime scenes to court processes, have the skills and the competence they need. And the bottom line in terms of the context that we're talking about is to ensure that when CCTV reaches the court and is presented in court, it is effective and it is of good quality, but of the standard that's required. But there is a challenge to this. So the challenge that's faced in implementing these standards is that currently the capacity to meet this huge growing demands that I think potentially could be global, but I can only speak from the perspective of England, is that we've seen an explosion of demand in terms of digital forensics, in terms of mobile phones. As Steve alluded to earlier, we've got the CCTV, massive amount of CCTV. And I think that makes it difficult for experts to keep up. But obviously the risk is that not everybody will be working to the same standard up until that compliance deadline of 2026. I mean, Stephen, is there anything you want to kind of add?
No, I mean, it's a very new take, and it is the quality drive has been happening in forensics for a number of years now, since they closed the National Forensic Service, and the take up at the moment is slow just because of the sheer volume. The standards are correct, and once applied, I think we will see a genuine uptick in terms of quality and the quality of media that gets put before the court. And I think that's obviously what everybody wants, is that it's right and proper, that it's of a suitable quality to be put to a jury or put to a court, and that's going to take time, simply because of the reasons that we've given previously. That the volume really is one of the biggest issues, and it's very easy to deal with this media without using a validated system. And that's another thing. The accessibility of CCTV and its use has come to a point where almost anybody can download CCTV and take it away, but do they handle it properly? And I think that's something that is being addressed, but it is a slow process, and there's a lot of bad practice still going on.
But also it leaves that gap, doesn't it? That if compliance is currently 2026, I mean, could that deadline be moved? But also in the meantime, you've got varying degrees of practice going on up until that point, haven't you?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the weaknesses, that there's maybe one of the thrusts of the presentation, really, from my angle, is that there's not enough checking from both sides, really. How robust is this evidence, and what level is it given? I would always argue that unless it's broadcast quality video, it's only ever going to be supporting evidence. And and that's coming from somebody that uses this evidence to make a living. It's what we do. We edit videos for court. It's our core business. But we want to make sure that when we are presenting this kind of evidence, it's the best it possibly can be. But we're just one voice. So it's almost a uphill battle, and almost getting the courts to see that it does have value, and not to dismiss it, and to treat it with the respect it deserves. It's not DNA, it's not fingerprint, but it can be to that level. You know, we're getting there in terms of quality that it could be.
And I think, so whilst we've highlighted the benefits, the disadvantages, I think, and that this is what, when I hand over to Steve in a minute, Stephen will show, is that actually, unless it gets recognised to be treated as the valuable evidence that it should be treated as, if you face, in cases, these kind of disadvantages. So poor quality CCTV can support a version of events, but doesn't really show much. It can be grainy, it can be distant, it can be really unclear. Then you get limitations. So once that is put in front of the jury, it's very, very difficult to then tell a jury, actually, what you've just seen, there are limitations to because of the poor quality. Because once they've seen it and they've been presented as part of potentially the prosecution narrative, which is more often than not that kind of narrative that's fed into, it's very, very difficult to then undo those first impressions that the jury have. So CCTV images and footage is extremely influential to a jury. They can create, you can use CCTV to create assumptions, or the jury can base their assumptions on it. And editing can change context, which I think Stephen will touch on very, very shortly. And ultimately what we're faced with is CCTV images and footage can lead, and do lead, to wrongful convictions and miscarriages of justice. And before I hand over to Stephen, in 2007, there was a joint report by the Home Office and the Police Service that found that 80% of CCTV images were of such poor quality that they were actually no good for police purposes. And the Police Foundation in 2014 noted that many CCTV operators lack the skills to handle CCTV footage effectively, and they're unaware of the evidential threshold necessary for CCTV to be used successfully in a prosecution case. So sometimes, ultimately, what we're then faced with at this stage, at the stage that Stephen picks it up, and certainly when the cases concerning CCTV come to the Innocence Project London, is that there's been an over-reliance on CCTV as evidence in a particular case. It doesn't show what it needs to show. And potentially where it's been edited, the context of what the jury are seeing has changed quite dramatically. And that opportunity to maybe put forward the limitations of the footage, of the CCTV evidence that's being presented, isn't always there because of the awareness, or limited awareness potentially, of the standards.
Yeah, I think that's, for me, to jump in there, Louise, in terms of the context issue is a big one, and it's still it's current every day, really. But I think it's not done with any malice. It's just because it's such a distinct view, i.e. the prosecution's case. I mean, we do it when we do defence work just as much as we do when we do prosecution work, that each team has their own story. And editing is a very big word. And generally, we're not really editing. We're basically removing stuff that, evidence, images that have no bearing, but it's who makes that decision. And that's one of the complex things. When we see an edit, it's an edit. We don't know what's been removed. So we don't know if it's been done well, badly. No matter whose side it's come from, you've got to take it and step back. And that's something the jury doesn't have the opportunity to do in a lot of cases, because they expect to see CCTV. Yeah. Certainly in the UK courts. Yeah. Almost disappointed if there's no video to watch. And we laugh about it, but it's a genuine issue where it's expected. And that's where this over-reliance comes from, in my mind, that sometimes we're a bit guilty of putting too much store in CCTV right from the start, when it can always support, but it's not the first place you should be going. And I think some of that comes from almost a fear of missing something, in terms of, you've got all this great evidence, we need to capture it all, and sometimes that's done without thought. And so we do see a lot of media that's been badly handled, which could help either side of a case, but because it's been so poorly handled, it helps nobody. And that's my biggest fear. It is changing, it is getting better, but that's one of the things that worries me more than anything, dealing with this on a daily basis.
Of course.
So we'll come on talk about quality of CCTV, which Louise thinks is really interesting, but obviously I find it rather tedious at this stage.
No, it's right. Well, you crack on, Stephen. I'm here.
This is just to give you an idea. This is a still from our internal CCTV, actually here in Acumae's offices. It's 2K, which is the pixels resolution that I've got there, which is 2,000 pixels by 1,000 pixels approximately. So in image terms, it's good quality. But this is not what we see on a daily basis, unfortunately. This is the exception. And it's only really imagery of this quality. If we can show the next slide. Sorry.
Yeah.
We didn't want to do a next slide, did we? But there you go.
No, go next slide. It's fine.
You get to see me a little bit better there. But when we're talking about CCTV and its value in identification purposes, it's very easy for anybody to watch a video, and if you've got common knowledge of that individual, it doesn't actually have to be that very good quality for somebody to say, "Oh, I recognise that's Louise," or "I can, I recognise my parents," or "I recognise one of my children." The quality doesn't have to be that good in order to make that connection. However, when you take it into the evidence field, that connection simply isn't good enough. I know that because, and this is where we come to the quality of CCTV and it being tested. So this is, as I say, this is a good quality CCTV system. There's a lot of these about. They're not, they're all made in China. They're probably global. They're becoming ubiquitous in every sort of domestic setting. And you can see fine feature detail. So I've included that enlargement just to show fine feature detail, which is what we as experts in identification rely on heavily. The only way we can make a positive ID that will stand the test in a court is by examining that and then comparing against somebody else. So we do comparison work to verify that ID. So that's one of the dangers is generally CCTV, you can recognize somebody because you know that person really well. You subconsciously know their mannerisms, how they move, etc. But that is not an ID that's good enough for court. Go to the next slide, just to give you a bit more fuller. So again, side view, need to lose some work, call it. But anyway, again, this is a good quality. This is an exception in the UK. This is probably 10% of the CCTV that we see in the office. So when we do see this, obviously it means we can do a better job for whoever the client is because we've got that image quality. But this is a rarity. We don't see it that often, unfortunately. We've got next slide, Louise, just to reinforce that point. So you can see fine feature detail that you can comment, or one of my experts could comment on in my facial features. And that's sort of the top of the end of the CCTV quality scale that we do see, but we rarely see. So that's got to be put. You want to go next slide, Louise?
Yeah, there we go.
So this is 1280 by 720. I should really explain that's a pixel measurement. So that's the number of pixels the frame size occupies. This is the more standard CCTV that we see probably 70% of. Again, very good for showing events, but not very good for identification. So this is what I'd normally call common. So a lot of what we see is this resolution. And it can record events. You can see a sequence of events. You can check a sequence of events. But in terms of identification, it has severe limitations. So for facial identification, you'd need somebody very large in frame to make a robust identification. It doesn't mean you can. It just limits what you can. And this is some of the problems with the declaration of CCTV and its limitations, that these aren't really set out to a court. These are the key facts that we work to, i.e. what's the frame rate, how big is the image size, what's the taking camera, what's the lighting like. As you can see in this instance, we've got backlighting from a shop window. We can hardly see the subject's face. So it's very difficult there's no mean. So just because it's this resolution at this frame rate doesn't mean it gets a big tick and it's usable. There's so many variables you've got to think about when you're looking at CCTV. and there's a lot for an expert to consider in terms of what they're going to be able to say about that. If that, now this is big if, an expert is engaged, so we do get a lot of instances, and I think this is one of the things that bears out in all CCTV is coming back to the reliance on the people recognizing themselves. You're more likely to recognize yourself on CCTV because it's you. But that doesn't mean it's good enough or robust enough to stand up in a court that it is you. I hope I'm making sense here, because there's two things. I'm not sure you're going to say, "Oh, that's not me." However, that to an identification that's robust enough for somebody to say it's definitely you because of X, Y, and Z in terms of your facial features or your height or your ethnicity, anything like that is a million miles away from the quality that you need to do that. And I think that's important to remember.
No, but I also think it goes back to the point about people being aware of these situations and being aware of what you've just said, because the jury won't be, will they? And
No.
more often than not, you've seen evidence come in like this. I've seen evidence come in like this in terms of how it's being used and to what end it's being used to. But the court isn't kind of told of those limitations. And I think that's from what we've covered in terms of the legislation, the policy and the guidance, it's relevant.
It is, and we unfortunately we do come across where it's face value is a bit is what a lot of CCTV accepted on. It's accepted at face values, and the issue goes beyond the CCTV itself. It goes to how is it actually presented in court.
Yeah.
In the UK court, we're lucky if you've got 2 TV screens at the back of the courtroom for a juror to look at, which could be 20 foot away before they're looking at CCTV. How's a juror supposed to assess that? I mean, as a company, we put screens in front of a jury. We literally stick a screen in front of a screen between 2 jury members to ensure that whatever we're presenting is seen in the best possible way. So we want them to see it how we've seen it. But that, again, is something that we have to fight for. We have to provide these extra things. And again, that's demeaning the value of the CCTV. In a lot of cases, it's picking up, and we're contracted to put equipment in so a jury can see, but it's still an educational problem where it's not happening universally.
Yeah.
And we're asking a jury to assess CCTV and listen to either the defense or the prosecution case, but it's something 20, 30 feet across a courtroom. How can they possibly test that CCTV in that way? They can't.
No.
And so that again comes back to the experts and the police and the defense teams highlighting the limitations and setting those out before we even get to this point. And that's one of the things that's starting to happen, but it's not happened in a lot of previous cases. And I think that's one of the issues. So, just coming back to that, I've gone off, but coming back to the quality, this is what we'd deem good quality. So with good lighting, good position of the camera, you could say it is good quality CCTV, but it has its limitations when you look at it in context with what we see today.
Yeah.
So if we go to the next slide. Yeah. So this 725/76, just to explain to everybody, this is a frame size that's a throwback from VHS tapes. So back in the day, this it'd be called PAL in the UK, NTSC in America. It's a screen size. It's a 4:3 screen size. So it can record really well, but in most instances, it's so limited in terms of what you've actually got that the level of detail is simply not there. So what we've had in the UK, we've gone from, just to give you a little bit of history, because I think it's important to understand, we've gone from having VHS systems that are generally in commercial properties or controlled, attached to really good cameras. So CCTV from 20, 30 years ago on VHS actually has a lot of value and can give a lot of evidence that's genuinely valuable, even now, after the fact, when you're looking at cold cases and appeals, etc. But we went through a transitional period where everything went digital, but it went digital at a time where technology almost hadn't caught up. So you could capture good quality images, but you couldn't store them. So everybody compressed everything. So you have this bit in the middle for 10 years where CCTV may be recorded and it looked great on the screen. And this is one of the problems that we touch upon, you can watch. I'm sure you can test this for yourselves. Anybody that's got domestic CCTV, go and watch your CCTV now. Probably looks superb. The quality will be great, but that's not what's being recorded.
Yeah.
And that's the big issue. Everything that's recorded is compressed. It loses information. Frames are thrown away, and these are the limitations that we don't talk enough about in court. And some of it's through ignorance. Again, coming back to the taking CCTV at face value, it happens a lot. But coming back to the image on screen right now, this is the type of CCTV we do see every day. So, it's limiting. This is taken at night. Identification is very, very tenuous if there's any value at all in that. You'd struggle to identify the scene itself, never mind the individual. And that's got to be given context. So in this particular case, the CCTV further down the street, which is superb quality. So quite happy that this is the same individual if you can demonstrate that continuity. And that's one of the things that we do a lot of, and to literally reinforce what you are seeing, that you may have continuity from good to bad to rubbish. And that's so it can still have value in filling gaps, but with a big warning triangle about its value.
With a big caveat attached to it.
Exactly. We don't know what's happened between the good footage and this. Is it the same? But so it's about more tests and being more open, I say, with the limitations, and it can still be used. It just you highlight, what you actually are working with, and that's one of the big things for us. That you've got to be realistic about what you can see and what you can say about something. So if we go on the next slide, we'll come on to the case we're actually working on. This is the Leon Wilson case, which is what brought me and Louise together. This is a frame from one of the key CCTV locations, and outwardly it's pretty good quality, and you could make robust identifications from it, and I believe the police have in this case. One of the problems we've got is that this is so detached and so removed from the actual event that it's actually hours apart. So this coming full circle back to how we contextualize things and how we present evidence. This, it's one of the worst I've ever seen in terms of making more out of something when you haven't got it. And what the views in this case is reasonable, good quality CCTV. We could make a fairly robust identification of people on this footage, which is what's done in order to identify subjects in the case. However, there's no mention that this is maybe 4. I think it's actually 4 hours before the event that we're talking about. So the actual attack, the actual murder, is 4 hours hence and in a different location. So
and also, there was no dispute as to our client or our the individual that we're obviously working with being there. He didn't dispute being there at all. No. But it was the way it was used, as you've said, in relation to other parts of the CCTV.
And that's one of the dangers that we see, where a narrative has been decided upon, and there's gaps in it, and if people aren't testing the gaps, it can be a problem. And this particular case was presented professionally. I'd say professionally is a strong word. We wouldn't do it how they've done it now, because they've changed the format, they've removed frames. We don't know what the original was like. We've had to fight tooth and nail to get to the original. And we'll come on to that in a little while. But the main thrust is that this narrative has got yawning hour gaps between it, and that's not been set out to the court. So although the ID wasn't challenged at the time, it clearly should have been, because the footage that they relied upon, and heavily relied upon in this case, simply isn't good enough to do that. So if we go next slide, Louise, we'll touch on that now. So this is the actual footage. Sorry, it makes me laugh because it's almost laughable that this was used as evidence. So this is one of the smallest frame sizes we ever see, and on this slide we're presenting it actual size, just so you can understand. So the image on the left of the frame is 352 pixels by 288 pixels. Just to give you a bit of a backstory to that, that's about 100,000 pixels, so 100,000 pixels of information. So little square blocks that give you that information. Just to give you some sort of benchmark, the average phone these days has something like 12 million pixels, so 120 times the resolution of the CCTV. So that gives you a benchmark. The phone in your pocket has got 120 times the resolution of the CCTV that, in this case, that's been relied upon in this case. So what you can see to the right is an enlargement of the actual area of interest. So that's what we're expected to look at and view and make a conscious decision on as a member of the jury and the court. If we go to the next slide, I'll actually play you a little clip. Not what I'm expecting to see. Should actually be a video playing there, but
yeah, I'm not sure that that's going to play.
Right. Can we go back to the last slide then?
Of
and
course.
I'll try and talk through it. Let's see what we've got.
There we go.
Unfortunately, the videos don't upload in this platform, but if you could maybe share the link here, I can share it with the audience in the chat.
Can you do that, Louise?
I can try. You talk and I'll try.
Yeah, I'm just trying. I'm just making sure I've got actual images that I can share with the guys. Yeah. So Adam, coming back to that, so that's an enlargement of the area, and we're supposed to expect that we can see individual movements in there. So we can see figures moving when we actually see the footage, and you can see how many figures. But to make them identifiable is beyond the pale. They amount to maybe 3 pixels by 1 pixel high for each individual in this case. So the link to them previously is tenuous at best, but probably more so than that. It shouldn't have been made with no actual link to the CCTV. So the CCTV has been used, I believe in this case, to back witness testimony. But the CCTV doesn't support that because it simply can't. It's not of good enough quality to make the link between a sequence of events that's recorded on CCTV and a witness viewpoint. So I know there's talk about weapons and various things that have been seen and not seen by witnesses, but none of that's recorded. So why rely on the CCTV evidence to support your case when it doesn't show it? And that's the key here. Is it's simply not good enough quality, but it was used in court to support the prosecution's case that X, Y, and Z had happened. And
I think actually, let me try and share my screen, and we can at least play one of them. I'm just conscious of time, but I think we can then. Here we go. We can at least then, if we play this one will probably. There we go.
Yeah, so not ideal, but that's what we're seeing there is an enlargement. So it's already an enlargement of an enlargement, and you can see the figures just moving to the sort of right of the screen. Now that's the recording of the offence relied upon at trial. You can't see anything. So why was the CCTV used? And I think in this case, it was simply through ignorance, really, that it supported a set of witness testimony, but it can't be tested. It's such raw resolution. We can't test that. It may be the witness testimony is absolutely spot on, but the CCTV doesn't support it, and that's the issue about testing and being open about limitations. Now,
I think it goes back again, doesn't it? I think to that awareness point in terms of, I mean, you've seen the jury bundle that was put together in this case, and included that kind of footage and included all other maps and things like that. And there's no footage that could be used in the legal sense as identification.
No.
And that's not just me, obviously.
No, that's key. That's the truth of the matter. It's simply not good enough to make identifications other than footage 3 hours prior in a location that's some distance away.
And is undisputed anyway.
Exactly, and is not disputed anyway because the subject admits that they were there. So it's about that value, and again, the limitations, reinforcing the limitations, being open about the limitations, and it doesn't stop it being used, but with that big health warning that this is what we purport to show, and then let the jury decide if it does or doesn't. But I would expect normally in that circumstance that it would have been challenged at the time, and unfortunately it wasn't.
No.
But you know, and the issue here is it's a very professional presentation.
Yeah.
The content is appalling and of little value, but the presentation itself is actually quite good. And I think that, unfortunately, that goes a long way. If it's professionally presented, it's almost accepted. And that's one of the things we need to do more of, making people aware of the limitations so they can test those limitations. Just coming back to this slide, because I hate looking at myself. There you go. Maybe I should explain this slide. So this slide is just to show you that what I've shown you earlier on is this is what we hope to see now in terms of image quality from CCTV in the UK. The inset is the actual frame size of the footage that was relied upon in the Leon Wilson case. So just a very, very quick and easy visual aid for you that's the size that would occupy in the frame of the good quality. So just to highlight how low quality that actually is.
How tiny tiny
pixels. Yeah.
Tiny pixels, yeah. There's a form in there somewhere, Stephen. We just need to find
it. Yeah. So, I'm conscious of running out of time, but I think one of the things is what Louise is going to touch about is it's about education and making the best of it and being open with limitations, because being open with limitations assists everybody right from the start. And gaps are gaps. If they can be explained, that's what they are. But you need to be able to explain them, and that's again, hopefully, it's an education thing that is starting to gain traction, certainly in the UK, where it is taken seriously, and it is at every level it's taken seriously. But it's still they need to address the fact that there is issues, and these issues are serious when it goes wrong.
Absolutely. And I think just bringing it back and just joining the dots back up to what we said kind of at the very beginning, what needs to happen? Well, obviously, Steve has mentioned education, but the simplified legal responsibilities for police forces would also go some way into assisting them in terms of what they need to do specifically for CCTV. In terms of the new accredited standard that we mentioned earlier, that rate of compliance needs to increase, and the expertise in the area does. That there's an awful long time until 2026 in terms of kind of that time that's elapsed, and there will be people operating at different standards with different levels of knowledge. That is something that could be addressed. But as Stephen said and mentioned, kind of more challenge, and that ties hand in hand with education, I think, in terms of the use of CCTV as evidence and policing the police. So frame rates, frame sizes, if more people knew within the criminal justice system, as Stephen has illustrated, what that actually means and the effect that has on CCTV imagery and footage as evidence, then we could be honest about it. The jury would know very openly those limitations, what those limitations look like, and then how to treat that evidence. And that is the way we treat all evidence in terms of limitations as well. There's certain rules that we have to talk about evidence with limitations. Stephen, final word to you just before we wrap it up.
I think that's, you've hit everything, really. It's just about accepting that it is very good evidence, but it needs that careful handling to make sure we get the best out of it.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for joining us on this session. I hope it's been, or we hope it's been, an insight a little bit into CCTV, the challenges that we face in terms of how that's presented in courts, and obviously the work that we're doing to rectify some of those situations that we've come across that we're now kind of facing in terms of how the CCTV is being used. Our details are there on the screen, and thank you ever so much for listening, and do enjoy the rest of the live stream events that are running today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.